Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. Every year about this time, people are cleaning out their garages and deciding what to do with the stuff they no longer want. We're confronted with the issue of whether to have a garage sale, take it to a thrift store, or maybe just put it on the curb and let the trash truck haul it off to the landfill, which is something that is filling up much quicker than it has to. My guest today is Laurie Davis, and she's going to tell us about the options that we have other than going to the landfill. She is the City Hall go-to person if you want to know more about recycling here in Springfield. Laurie, welcome to In Our Town.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, tell us, if you do nothing, where does our trash go here in Springfield?
Our trash goes to the City of Springfield Noble Hill Sanitary Landfill, which is located about 9 miles north of town. A lot of people think that a landfill is located where it's at so that the citizens don't have to see it or smell it, which are very real things. But the real reason our landfill is located where it is at is because of the type of rock formations that are located underground in that area. We have a special type of rock called an impermeable rock. Cotter dolomite and Northview shale make up the bedrock in that area. So when the city first purchased that land in 1975, that was the type of rock that was most prominent in that area. So it makes a perfect natural barrier. When we come along and put our stuff on top, it's a barrier that keeps things from leaking down into our community's groundwater supply.
Well, anybody that will look off to the west heading towards Kansas City on Highway 13, 5-6 miles out of town, you're going to see a big hill.
Exactly. It is a trash hill. Yeah, that hill that you can see from the highway is one of the original areas that trash was put. And we continue to kind of cycle our way back through what we call landfill cells. They're small sections that we carve out, and they are engineered and designed so that they have, in addition to the bedrock that's underneath the ground, we have lining systems that are in place that provide additional protection for keeping our groundwater safe. But yes, it is a hill of trash that we have covered with grass.
I do think that the city does a pretty good job policing it. There have been days when you might see a little trash along the highway, but not too bad. And I haven't noticed that problem in recent years. But it's still, my goodness, how much trash and waste goes into the landfill on a daily basis?
Currently, we are bringing in somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 tons per day. And that represents waste not just from Springfield, but also from some of our outlying communities. We are a regional landfill, so we take in waste from some of the smaller communities as well. It's very expensive to build and operate a landfill. And so we serve the needs of not just our citizens, but also citizens in the surrounding areas.
And one of the arguments for doing that, of course, is if we don't do a good job in handling that waste stream, it'll go elsewhere, but the underground water supply goes everywhere.
Correct. And when you think about litter that escapes, so much of what you're going to see along the side of the road on Highway 13, as you mentioned, is litter that has made its way out of the landfill because it's so lightweight. And we get these nice spring winds that just lift things up and over the barriers that we have in place. We're required by the Department of Natural Resources to do a lot of different things to control and house our trash, and keeping things from escaping the landfill is one of those. But things that make their way onto the land are eventually going to also make their way into our waterways. And so trash on the ground also has a potential of polluting our waterways. So we want to keep those clean as well.
1,000 to 1,200 tons per day. But how much of that waste stream could actually be recycled if we had the will to do it?
Having the will to do it and actually doing it sometimes can be two different things. We did what's called a waste audit in 2016, and that was conducted in collaboration with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And they pulled some representative trash trucks and had them dump their load and then hand sorted and categorized the material that was in there. So it gave us a snapshot in time of what types of materials were coming in to the landfill at that time. And there's about 70% of the material coming into the landfill that could potentially have been either recycled or repurposed or donated to a thrift shop or put to use somewhere else and kept out of the landfill. There is a federal law that says once material goes into the landfill, it is required to stay there. So even if material had been in good shape before it went into the landfill, once it gets deposited there, it has to stay there. So we as citizens need to make the decision before something goes into the landfill, if it could be repurposed or reused, have to keep it out of the landfill to begin with.
So if we lived in a perfect world, perhaps 70% of the waste stream would be getting recycled. How far away are we from a perfect world here in Springfield?
We definitely have a ways to go. And Springfield is not the only community. We are not alone in that statistic nationally. There are many, many other cities around our nation that have those same types of numbers where 70% of the material going into a landfill could have been repurposed or recycled or reused.
I know it's a guess, but how much do you think we're doing here in Springfield in terms of recycling?
The national rate is about 34%. We probably are less than that. And if you think about human nature, the more effort something takes to do, the less likely you are to do that thing. And so when recycling isn't necessarily always convenient, it definitely makes it more challenging for a citizen to do. If you're doing all of your recycling via our city centers, our drop-off centers, which we have available to citizens at no cost, but you still have to haul it there and you have to sort it before you take it there because everything has to be subdivided, as opposed to if you have curbside recycling available, that one you can put everything in and commingle it, but it's still an effort that you have to do. And then you have to remember which week is the recycling week.
Anything and everything goes into the waste stream, but let's go through some different items and what might be done with them. I think I saw you on a TV program not too long ago, a local news station, and you talked about clothing and toys and so forth. Tell our listeners what your recommendations are with those items.
Yeah, we have on our city website a resource called the Waste Wizard. And so if you're wanting to get rid of a kid's toy, you would type in kiddie pool or dolls or kids' clothing, and then it would pull up for you all of the different places around town where you can donate those items so that they can have a second life for someone else. Now, as a citizen, it's going to be my responsibility to make sure I clean up that item a little bit so that it has a gently used look to it, instead of if it's really gross and something that I'm not going to want to touch, then somebody else isn't going to want to touch either. So I want to try to clean it up so that it's in good shape for the next user of this item.
And my suspicion is, I read a statistic one time that 70% of the things that are brought to the thrift store end up in the waste stream anyway, and they don't have the time or the budget to clean them themselves.
Right. And again, if it looks like trash and it does not have the ability to be used or have that gently used appearance, yes, let's save the landfill for those things that definitely need to go into the trash, that they absolutely can't be used again. But for those things that are still in good condition, I'm going to want to make the effort to make sure that whoever I'm donating this to doesn't have that responsibility to clean up my leftover item.
Years ago, I was on the board for the kitchen when Sister Lorraine was operating it, and people would drop off items there. And a lot of time, frankly, it was just junk. But we were told you never turn anything away, that you don't want to discourage people in their giving. But in some ways, ironically, we were being tasked to do one more job rather than helping out the poor.
Right. And then it becomes the agency's responsibility to get rid of the extra cost of extra trash that they weren't counting on. And the same thing happens a lot at our materials recovery facilities, also known as a MRF. They are the people who get all of our recycled materials. contamination is the number one problem that they face of people putting in, their leftover milkshake, and the plastic container is probably recyclable, but they don't rinse it out and get all the food gunk out of it before they toss it into the recycling bin. And so food waste is a significant contributing factor to contaminating a load of recycled materials.
Well, at our house, we recycle. We have 2 dumpsters, and one is stuff that we think should go to the landfill at least. And then we have the cans and the glass and the plastics and the cardboard and paper. And my wife and I are not really sure, do we need to put all that stuff in a separate little bag, or can it just go in one big container? You have to ask yourself, when the trash hauler picks them up, how do they end up at the other end? Maybe you can give us some advice on that.
For the recycling materials?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And isn't it amazing when you start separating your materials that can be recycled from your stuff that is actual trash, how much more recycled materials you have in your bin than your trash usually?
To your point, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, frequently the recyclable stuff is more than the stuff that goes in the trash stream.
Right. So when you're putting things into your recycling bin to separate them out, if you're doing it at our centers, yes, you need to separate them out. But most of our trash haulers, if you have curbside recycling, you can put it all into your commingled bin except for glass, because glass, if you think about that material, once it breaks, it is impossible to separate it out.
Uh-huh.
So most of our curbside haulers will not take glass. That has to come to our city centers. But once it gets to the materials recovery facility, then they have technology that helps to separate things out so that the paper goes in one direction, the aluminum or the steel or tin cans are going to go in another direction, the plastic bottles and plastic containers are going to go in another direction, the cardboard is going to go in another direction, so that it all gets separated. Our role would be to make sure that the material going in is the right type of material and that it's clean and ready to be passed along. I always encourage people to think about the materials that you put into your recycling bin as the raw materials for a new product. The better quality the material, the better the next step in the process of making it into something.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Kay, and I'm the visual journalist at the Springfield Daily Citizen. I started out working overnights at KTTS. I did do my internship at KSMU. After that, I traveled on down to Branson. I very quickly became the news director down there. Afterward, I started working for Carbon Trace Productions, and there I was the executive director. I really see being a journalist in general as being a public service. My days, they are both regimented and not at all. Doing like my day-to-day task, which includes like the calendar and the obits, from touring along with one of the reporters to working on a Photoshop project so that way we can really make our product here at Springfield Daily Citizen shine. One of my favorite things about living in Springfield is that you never know who you are going to meet. We are one of those like big, small towns, and so you can meet these people that are internationally famous and you find out that they live in Springfield.
I've heard that there's not much of a market for plastic, and maybe we shouldn't be trying to cycle that.
Well, you should never not recycle it if we have the option. And we are fortunate to have 2 materials recovery facilities here in Springfield that take the material. So even if there isn't a market right now, the markets are up and down. And the market is dependent on, number one, the quality of the material going in. And number 2, just the demand for the material. Your recycling is only going to be as good as the infrastructure for building and making new things out of that raw material. And so even though there might not be a market for it now, our materials recovery facilities typically will stash that material until the markets come back up and there is more of a demand and a higher price for that material because it is a business for them.
So eventually it does get recycled.
Yes. Yeah.
And certainly not going to happen about plastic soda bottles in the bottom of the landfill.
right. Yes. In order for them to be recycled, they have to be in a recycling bin, not the trash bin.
Economics, you've alluded to it a few times through here, but that really drives this business, doesn't it?
It really does. And recycling is not only answer to all of this. From the perspective of consumers, we always have choices when we go to purchase things. Part of that can be looking at it through the lens of, do I absolutely need that item? The word no is still an option, believe it or not.
Uh-huh.
It's probably the least popular option because I don't want to say no to that thing because I want it, but it's a question of, do I need it or do I desperately only want it? And then some of the ways that we utilize materials. So do I have to always buy plastic single-use water bottles, or could I invest in a reusable water bottle that I can fill up throughout the day so that I'm not using, 6 single-use bottles throughout the day? I've got my one that I can refill and use over and over again.
Well, I have to observe how ironic it is when I use a glass bottle, actually carry around my car, and I fill it up out of the water from the faucet. I think it tastes just great. But anyway, when I'm traveling, sometimes I'll stop, get a bottle of water, and I'm always amazed about this water costs more than the gasoline I just purchased at the pump. But it's got a nice name on it, and it says it's spring water or something.
Yeah. I think we would be shocked if we were paying, the price per gallon of our water, if we knew what that price was every time we go to reach for the single use compared to what we're putting into our gas pumps. If we use that same measurement, we would be shocked.
As you may know, I was on city council for many years, and so I remember what I'll call the trash wars. Back in the 80s, the idea was, well, let's burn all the trash. And we had 2 votes. One was to build an incinerator, and we were going to raise the dumping fees at the landfill. And to do it, it was something like it was going to go from $6 to $60. Now, that's not immediately, but over the long haul. And that went down in defeat. And we came back and said, well, how about if we have a bond issue and don't raise the dumping fees quite as much? Got closer, but that went down. And then we had the MRF proposal. You know about that. That was in the 90s. And essentially, we were going to have a gigantic conveyor belt. And all the stuff would go on the conveyor belt, and people would pick off the stuff that was recyclable. The voters approved that. But the problem with that was we had to be able to force the trash haulers to come and use our landfill. Voters approved it, but then the United States Supreme Court said that we were violating some antitrust law or something like that.
Right.
So that went down in flames. And then the next thing was, well, we considered this. We got these big trash trucks that go all over town. And we thought, well, let's franchise them. So one company gets this part of town and everybody would bid for it. But there was a lot of sympathy for the mom and pop trash haulers. We had Moore's Trash Service. I think they've taken our trash now for 30-some years and didn't want to see Mr. Moore go out of business. So that went down the tubes.
Right.
And then we tried to just raise the fees a little bit. And the waste company said, well, it's cheaper for us to just operate our own landfill.
Right. Right.
And that raises environmental concern. Are they going to be as motivated as we might to make sure that the environment's taken care? It's not an easy solution.
It is not. Every landfill, whether it is publicly or privately operated, is under the supervision and the regulations of the Environmental Protection Agency. So every landfill that is constructed in our nation has to follow the same environmental protection standards for construction and design and operation. But yeah, who knew that trash could have so many different variations and so many issues with it? It is definitely not a boring topic.
Tell us about the collection of the methane project at the landfill and how that's working and how we're producing electricity.
So we have had a collaboration with city utilities since, I believe it was 2006. Where they built a small substation just about 300 feet south of the landfill. And there are pipes that connect our methane collection system to their substation. We are required by Missouri Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Agency to capture our methane gas. We can't allow it to escape into the atmosphere. So we have this pretty complex system. It operates almost like a giant vacuum for collecting and pulling all of the methane gas out of the landfill.
You've got a whole bunch of pipes with holes
Yes.
in it that are running throughout the landfill.
Well, the methane doesn't have the holes, but
The pipes, though, to suck.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
what I
So
meant to say.
yes. So those pipes are installed underground where the trash is at. And so the methane collection system pulls that methane out, and then a portion of that is pumped over to the city utilities facility where they run it through generators, and it's transformed into electricity that then gets put out back onto the grid.
But it's a small amount, like 1% of the total power that's produced by the utility
Yeah.
comes from there. But it's something.
It's something, and something is always going to be better than nothing in terms of how much it can power. I believe we can power about 2,000 homes in the winter and about 1,000 homes in the summer, just because of the difference in the amount of electricity needed for the different heating sources of those two different seasons.
Well, the other beneficial impact, of course, is methane leaves a bigger carbon footprint than just about anything.
Yeah.
And so we're at least dealing with that.
Right. In terms of impact on climate and atmosphere, it is a very heavy gas. And so it is definitely not one that we want to allow to escape out into the atmosphere. We can't do that anyway.
Somebody's got to talk to all those cows that are belching.
Oh, well, yeah, we are not responsible for them. We're only responsible for the landfill methane.
Well, you're the outreach coordinator for the city on these issues. Tell me what's going on with the young people.
This is probably one of my favorite parts of my job. I frequently describe my job as I get to go out and talk trash with the community.
Talk trash.
And all ages. And so we have been in preschool classrooms. We have been in high school classrooms. We have been over at the universities and working with college students. This is the next generation of citizens. So anytime we can plant the seed of what are some things you could do differently with your trash instead of always putting it into the trash can, thinking about, is this item something that could potentially be recycled or repurposed or reused? Because we don't want to always point just to recycling. There are so many materials that can't be recycled, but they could absolutely be repurposed or reused. And then getting kids to start thinking like a consumer, because they are going to be the future of our consumers, and they're going to be the next generation of making those decisions as consumers. When you go to buy something in the grocery store, and if I'll use applesauce as an example. If I have the choice between buying my applesauce in a big plastic jar, or I can buy it in a glass jar, or I can buy it in the single serve cups, the choice that is going to be the best in terms of reuse of that material is going to be the glass jar. It's probably going to cost a little bit more, and it's definitely a little bit heavier to ship for a company. But in terms of longevity of the material and being able to recycle it again and again and again, or reuse it, glass jars are great to reuse and put all kinds of different things into.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting kids, the next generation of consumers and citizens, to be thinking along those lines, that's probably one of the best things about my job.
Everybody's busy and they can't do everything. But if you were going to say to the average person out there, here are the top 2 or 3 things that you can do that can make a significant difference. What's that?
I would say start with doing a personal inventory of the number of items that you're using that are single-use plastic, and start there. So your single-use plastic bottles, those generate a lot of extra plastic waste. And then along with that, the single-use or the plastic shopping bags. Invest in a few reusable shopping bags. We have those available. We would be happy to distribute those to citizens if they want some and can't get them. You just have to promise that you remember to take them out of your car when you go to the store.
That's a challenge for those
Yes,
of us that are...
I have that same battle. And then just being aware of your choices and thinking about, is this something that when I'm done with it, looking at the lifespan of a material, So the top two would be the reusable shopping bags and then the reusable single-use water bottles as opposed to a reusable. And then doing some personal inventory. Is there anything else that I'm using that maybe I have a different way to do it, or I could refuse to use it?
Come down on the ongoing debate, paper or plastic at the checkout.
I go with paper when I can. A lot of times I just don't even get that choice. And I try to avoid that choice altogether because I do usually take in my reusable shopping bags.
Tell our listeners what's available in terms of recycling centers.
The city operates 3 recycling centers. We have our Franklin, which is just off of Chestnut Expressway. Our Lone Pine, which is just off of Lone Pine and is probably our most popular center. And then we also have a recycling center out at our yard waste recycling center. So you can drop off your yard waste and your collection of recyclables. Those are operated by our staff and they are available Tuesdays through Saturdays, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and they're free to use. So I would encourage people, if they've been thinking about getting involved in recycling, maybe even just start with one thing. Right now, I'm going to start with just collecting all of my single-use plastic bottles, and that's all I'm going to recycle. And start there. Start small because it is a very overwhelming project. If you start looking at everything, it's easy to get overwhelmed really fast.
Last question. If people want to know more, where should they find out?
They can go to www.springfieldmo.gov/recycling, and all of our information about how to recycle, what to recycle, access to our Waste Wizard searchable database tool is there, and how to contact staff if they have additional questions or want to schedule a presentation or a classroom visit. We do tours to the landfill or our recycling centers. So we're here for the community, and we just want to be able to let people know that we want to help.
Laurie, I want to thank you for being today's guest on In Our Town.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.